Okay, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control. I'm here with Paresa Noble. You can find us on social media. Be sure to follow Third Stage and myself, Eric Kimberling. You can connect with us on LinkedIn, where we're very active in social media discussions. You can also follow us or subscribe to us on YouTube. You can also find us on Twitter and Facebook as well. So be sure to engage with us there for more content like this, as well as other stuff that we put out there on a daily basis. So, Paresa, we just chatted about change management with Tammy and Sarah. What were some of your observations about change management and just some of the lessons that they provided here in today's discussion?
Yeah, I think this is one of my favorite topics because it's an intangible piece, right? You can't see it, you can't really, you can't touch it, but it weighs so much and it plays such a huge role in the success of a digital transformation. So I thought it was very interesting, and their perspectives went a long way. I think Tammy made a point that stood out to me about how people really want instant gratification. So that's sometimes why they may overlook pouring into an organizational change management strategy from the get-go. But it literally makes or breaks the project. I mean, you could have the leading technology, right? But if you don't have people behind it operating it the correct way, then you don't have much, right? So I guess my question is, I'm curious, you guys talked a lot about start as soon as possible. Before, if you start thinking about going on a digital transformation journey, you should have already started thinking about organizational change management. So you start early. Is the finish line go live for organizational change management, or is there some best practices around what you do after go live as well, to make sure that your team is adjusting to the new technology?
Yeah, it's a great observation. It does not end at go live, or it shouldn't end at go live. I think, unfortunately, so many projects and project teams think of it as a finite, finishing point or whatever the case may be. But the reality is, a couple things. One is that usually when you go live, that's oftentimes the most disruptive and the most risky time within your transformation. So more than ever at any other point in the project, that's when you need change management the most. Just if anything, just to help stabilize processes and operations and people's sanity and morale and all that good stuff. But beyond that, even if you look past the initial first few weeks or months after go live, there's an opportunity to continuously improve and optimize what you just implemented. And it always fascinates me how the dynamic of how organizations will spend millions of dollars on these big transformation projects, and then they just do nothing after go live. They're done. And maybe they provide a little bit of hypercare support or change management support after go live, but then they sort of taper off and they just go on their merry ways, forget about technology for a while until, 10 or 20 years go by and they realize, our system is totally misaligned with how we've grown as a business. And they're back in the same situation where they feel like they need new technology. So if you do it right, to answer your question, the change management should extend definitely past go live, and even, I would argue, more of a continuous improvement sort of approach to where it really never ends.
Yeah, ongoing. I mean, that makes sense. I'm curious, what would you say is like one tactic that you could do during the transformation, and how does it differ from the tactic that you would do after go live? Like, how do they compare? What are some things that are different between the strategies?
Yeah, so before go live, if you start it early enough, generally what you're doing is you're assessing the culture in the organization and trying to anticipate where the resistance to change or where the change management obstacles might come from. Because it's almost like a tip of the iceberg type of thing where, when you're an executive or even on a project team, you see maybe just some minor signs of resistance or organizational issues, and that's the tip of the iceberg. But as you go further down the path of the transformation, you get further into it and you're starting to change processes and roles and responsibilities, and then you start communicating those changes. That's where the resistance and the confusion and the chaos organizationally starts to happen. So the key is, can we start it soon enough? To your point, can we start change management early enough in the cycle to where we can anticipate what those potential issues may be based on the type of company it is and the culture and some of that other stuff. But then just as importantly, what can we prescribe in a prescriptive way to address those proactively? So it's more of a strategic, proactive approach to change management, and then and that's what's happening early in the project. But then when you get to go live, a lot of times it's more, I hate to say it, but it's a little bit more of the reactive. You're looking at what didn't we catch, or what issues did we not anticipate, or maybe we didn't address well enough, or we need to do more. So for example, a lot of times you find after go live that there's certain processes that aren't working right, or people aren't doing their job right because either they haven't been trained appropriately, so there's some refresher training that might need to happen, or a business process exception wasn't well defined in the early stages of the project. It could be that the software has a problem that wasn't configured right, so you've got to reconfigure the software. So a lot of times it's more root cause analysis of why are we having these issues, and it actually goes, I would argue, even beyond change management. It's more of a benefits optimization sort of exercise that's pretty heavy on the change management side, because that's usually where most of the problems are. So I'd say the biggest difference is that proactive strategic view that happens early on, and then later post go live, usually you're getting more into a reactive problem solving type of mode.
Right. That makes complete sense. So, okay, looking at the proactive side, I'm curious about resistance, and you guys talked a little bit about it during your conversation, but I'm curious, how can you be proactive and capture the unintentional resistance, and kind of, plan for that when you don't, the people who are showing the resistance or will show the resistance don't even realize that they're opposed to it. So how are you supposed to know? How can you
Yeah.
identify resistance like that?
Well, you're hitting on a really common misconception about change, human behavior, and people's resistance to change. I think when people think of change management issues or even resistance to change, they think of something blatant like Eric just doesn't want this change to happen, or Eric's digging at his heels because he doesn't want to see this transformation be successful. And usually that's not the case. I mean, you certainly have a few exceptions within any organization where someone is just flat out against this project and maybe even trying to sabotage it, or trying to undermine the success. And actually, that sort of resistance is a lot easier to deal with because it's so obvious, and it's easier to deal with it directly head on. The more common, I'd say 95% of change management issues are more subtle. It's not that people don't mean well, because I think most employees and most organizations mean well. They want the company to succeed. They generally see the need for change. So it's not a matter of do they see the need for change. It's what happens when you start messing with their lives. What happens when you start changing their processes, their roles and responsibilities. For example, you start automating the job of someone who's spending, say, 50% of their time is spent in Excel spreadsheets, going out and tracking down manual data, crunching it in a spreadsheet and spitting out some kind of report. If that's half my job, and then now you're going to roll out technology that sounds good to me in theory, but now you're telling me you're going to automate that part of my job, suddenly I'm not quite as excited. Not because I don't want the best for the company, but because now I'm worried about myself. I'm worried about, am I going to have a job? What am I going to do? Certainly I can't have a job or stability in this company if half of my job is going to go away. I mean, that's the way I start thinking. And so I might start resisting things a little bit for that reason, or because I take pride in that spreadsheet that I created and have used to manage my job, and now you're taking it away from me. For those two reasons, those are very subtle things that are going to trigger some sort of resistance. And it might be that I just start to second guess the technology that's being deployed, saying, oh, see, it can't do all the things my spreadsheet can do, and therefore we need to find a way to get that software to do what my spreadsheet could do. And then you start talking about customization and stuff like that. That's a whole nother rabbit hole and whole nother discussion. But that's just an example of how that person could mean well from day one, but then you start changing their lives, and that's just one individual example. You take that times however many dozens or hundreds or thousands of employees you might have in your organization, and you have that many issues that start to accumulate, that creates change management resistance, and that's pretty powerful, and it's hard to see. So back to your point of how do you anticipate that, a lot of it is understanding the culture of the organization, because a lot of times it comes down to the culture of weaknesses and strengths of any culture. So for example, if you're a organization that has communication issues from between different departments, let's just say you're operating in silos and there's not a lot of cross collaboration or communication between departments, that's a sign that chances are in the future that's going to create tension when you start to talk about integrated workflows and common operating models and things like that. So that's an area we know we need to focus on, this whole concept of cross department communication and collaboration. That's going to be a change management issue that we need to create a plan and strategy for that's specific to that specific issue. So people may not be saying it. Usually organizations don't say ahead of time, like, change management is going to be a problem because we're not very good at collaborating across departments. They don't generally think that way or anticipate that. They just assume that the technology will help fix the problem. So it's definitely a part art, part science. We use quantitative tools, for example, to measure some of the stuff, but we also use a lot of qualitative tools to understand and anticipate some of those things that, to your point, is difficult to do. It's not easy, but if you've done it enough times and you see enough organizations like we do or outside consultants do, that can be very powerful.
You said companies don't realize that they're not good at collaborating cross-departmentally until, they just think that the technology is going to help that. That reminds me of one of my favorite quotes. It's character shines through adversity. I don't know who said it, but that's my favorite quote. And I feel like that applies to this. I mean, adversity in this situation being a new change, something different, putting in a new technology, I mean, that's going to test you and test your limits as an organization. It might highlight some of the things that you're not very good at. So, I think it's important for leaders to be open-minded and self-aware as they go through this. And I think a lot of that plays into your change management strategy
Yeah,
based on what you're saying. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. And
So another thing,
I
go
was just going to
ahead.
say, every change strategy looks a little bit different too. Every organization is going to have a different strategy, different tactics. It's almost like, we've got these big change management toolboxes. We just need to pull out the tools and the tactics that are appropriate to any given situation. So it's another thing to note too. There's not a one size fits all answer for change management.
Right. That makes complete sense. I mean, just like there's not a one size fits all software for a company or multiple companies. So, another thing too that you guys talked a lot about was benefits realization. And if you don't properly manage the change on the people side and kind of easing your team into adopting this new technology, you're not going to maximize your benefits realization. So I wanted to just kind of take a step back and talk about the benefits, and kind of hear it from you with all of the clients that you've worked with, big projects, small projects. What are some of the leading benefits, excuse me, of going through a transformation like this the right way and pouring into OCM and, doing your due diligence up front?
Sure. Well, you certainly have call it your typical benefits that people expect to see from a transformation. Things like, more automated and efficient business processes, better customer service or better customer journey or experience that you're providing to your customers, reduced inventory, increased profitability. There's a lot of tangible, measurable benefits that most organizations are expecting to see from their transformation. And if you do change management right, you just accelerate and actually help realize those benefits. So it's almost like it's not that change management gives you additional benefit. It's just that it removes the headwinds that block you from achieving the benefits you would expect to get from any sort of transformation or technology initiative. Probably the bigger one though, or a big one that people don't oftentimes think about, and it's harder to measure and it's harder to anticipate, is not only the benefits realization, but even if you back up a little bit and just look back at what you were asking before about go live, what happens at go live and what does our company look like, our organization look like at the time we go live? Is it going to be a total chaotic disaster where people are just freaking out and there's a bunch of fire drills and we can't ship product, we can't close the books? That's the type of environment that companies find themselves in a lot in the short term after a go live, and that takes a toll on an organization. I mean, it totally undermines all your expected benefits that we just talked about, but it creates morale issues and you start to burn people out and people start to doubt and second guess leadership and all that stuff. So there's a hidden benefit there in the short term, and that benefit is actually very large, because if you think of all the money that can be lost from a disruptive go live in terms of lost sales orders or shipments you can't get out the door, or whatever, you can't close the books, or you can't collect money, that's another big one, or you can't pay your employees, that happens sometimes. I mean, any of those things can be catastrophic, and change management is designed to help mitigate those shorter term, but I would argue can be even bigger benefits or lost benefits in the case of the negative situations.
Right. So it's a huge topic. I know Tammy called it the teddy bear of digital transformation, but it it's only because you can't see it or touch it, but it truly is so important. It makes or breaks your project. So definitely an important conversation.
Yeah, yep, definitely. And while she may have referred to it as a teddy bear of transformation, it's important for executives not to think of that or mistake that for being touchy feely or optional or nice to have, because it is so critical to transformation. I think a lot of just so many companies, it's amazing. It astonishes me actually how many organizations think it's just a nice to have, or they think we're doing change management. We're training people. What's the big deal? We're communicating. We're sending out emails. We're going to train them right before go live. Everything's fine. But that's just scratching the surface of where change management comes in. So, yeah, definitely an important topic for sure. So, the conversation with Daryl was very interesting, and it was interesting hearing you ask the questions, just because you don't know her as well as I do, and kind of coming at it from a fresh perspective. Really interesting. I mean, what were some of your favorite points, or some of the things that you thought stood out the most in that conversation that you had with her?
Yeah, I love that whole conversation. First of all, I think she has so many great insights, so I love talking to her about it, and I'm excited to continue the conversation with her in the future. But I will say one thing that really stood out to me was her calling out the point that leaders are getting in the habit of looking at people as commodities. And sometimes it's easy to lose sight of that human factor when you're looking at professionals or IT professionals specifically as kind of a plug and play into a job. If a coder isn't working out, you're going to get another coder, or kind of approaching it in that mindset. And if you have these predetermined expectations, you're kind of capping people's creativity, which I just thought was absolutely accurate. I mean, I feel like you get the most out of people when you inspire that entrepreneurial spirit and encourage them to kind of do what they think should be happening, giving some guidance, obviously, as a leader, but also fostering that ingenuity. I think that is what really sets teams, companies apart. And it's a shame when you see leaders kind of falling back into that, you know, everybody's replaceable mindset, because I imagine leaders that do this are going to see a high turnover if you're looking at them as just another commodity, not kind of fostering what they need both professionally and personally. I mean, why would they stay when they could go somewhere else and find that in a different leadership team? So I'm curious on your thoughts. I mean, you're leading this ship with Third Stage. Tell me your thoughts on that approach for, a company that has leaders that have that kind of everybody's replaceable mindset. What does the future hold for that type of company?
Yeah, yeah, it's a good question. I can speak from experience on sort of the downside consequences of that. I mean, that's something that happened at my previous company, and part of the reason that we've talked about on other episodes, and I've talked about in other videos. Part of the reason why I left that organization that I started was because some of the new leadership and the ownership that we had brought in to help grow the company had that mentality of everyone's replaceable. These high paid, difficult consultants that are hard to manage. We can replace you very easily, and it creates a high level of distrust. First of all, I mean, it's hard to trust one another when you're replaceable, and that your team members are replaceable, and everyone's thinking it and observing that. So it creates a high degree of distrust, and it just creates a really toxic, negative culture. And that actually was, in my opinion, the downfall of my previous company. And it was a hard lesson for me too, or in many ways. Not that I intentionally wanted that or expected to see that from the company I started, but that's where it ended up. And so I knew when I started Third Stage, I had to do things different. We've talked about the cultural aspect in other episodes. So I knew we had to focus on culture. And part of the culture we're trying to create at Third Stage that's actually very difficult in this industry is just creating a diverse group of people. On one hand, you want a common culture to where it's a very distinct culture. You're not all rowing in a million different directions. You're all, you share the same values, philosophies about consulting, the way you interact with clients. You want people that are aligned in that way, but you also want diverse people. So it's really it's a hard balancing act, especially in this industry where it is male dominated. I mean, most people in this industry look like more like me than more like you, and so or a lot of people that look less like a lot of people in the world. So how do you create a culture that kind of builds that diversity, but also keeps the common core, and you're heading in the same direction. So easier said than done, but it's a art that's lost, and it's an art that's very important to building any sort of team or company.
Absolutely. I think, you know, too, it comes with experience and learning. If you're a leader that has that mentality, you probably don't realize that you have that mentality until
Yeah.
adversity comes your way, and then you become a little bit more self-aware about how you're treating your team and what impact that's having on your team and productivity, etc. So I think that says a lot. But yeah, I've experienced it as well. As on the other end of it is, are the leaders that you're working with understanding that you have other personal commitments, and maybe you're not able to I mean, I think Daryl made the example of joining this conference call at 8 a.m., but you can come in a little bit later and do, great work a little bit later and adjust. So I think 2020 pushed a lot of leaders because you had to be flexible. I mean, kids are at home doing schoolwork. I mean, doing everything changed. So I feel like, again, we keep coming back to this concept of change and adversity, but talk about adversity in 2020. I think this pushed a lot of leaders over that edge to hopefully be a little bit more flexible, understand their employees a little bit better, so that they aren't necessarily putting them in these boxes, and hopefully driving more productivity as a result.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And it's just, and I think it makes it interesting for makes for a more interesting work environment for people too. On one hand, you want to be around people like you, but it's also interesting and more rewarding, fulfilling to have diverse opinions and backgrounds and skill sets and things of that nature, for sure.
Right. Right. And talking about diversity, so one question that I asked her was about, what has it been like for your career, working in a male dominated industry? And she made a couple great points that, you don't think about often. She said, not in an intentional way have I been phased by it, but it's more so that natural progression of people, being drawn to like and like, so if, she could go golfing with the guys, sure, but is it a natural fit? Not necessarily. So that alone could play into how strong your relationships are built with your coworkers, when majority of them are, of the opposite sex. So that's one thing. And then she also made a point that I think, is one of the more understandable, more commonly identified reasons of the difference is the concept of women speaking up, being aggressive at the table, etc. Is it pleasant to be an aggressive woman, and you're kind of in your own head as a woman thinking, I don't want to come off too strong and, offend this person. Whereas, do men really think about that? It's kind of on a psychological level. So I'm curious. I mean, you are an ally, right? I mean, look at this show, right? You said you're outnumbered,
I
right?
think I
So
am.
you are outnumbered. So I'm curious to get your insights. What would be, your advice to women who are looking to break into the tech industry, or specifically grow into a leadership role within this industry? What would you say to them, and how would you encourage them?
Yeah, well, I think it's a really good question that I wasn't prepared for. Even though you prepared me for that question. um, no, it's a interesting thought, because on one hand, and I'm thinking of Daryl here in her personality. So she's got, she's quite frankly, she's tougher and stronger than most men. I would argue. I mean, if you've worked with her, just her personality and her determination, her strong leadership. But, and this is just my opinion, I don't know if other men that have worked with Daryl would agree with this, but I don't find it threatening. I don't find it abrasive. It's not, it doesn't trigger anything in that way for me. But I think, to your point, a lot of women might worry about that. So I think, it's a good question. I think women have the advantage, though, of being able to temper that strength with the softer side that men don't have, and I think that's what makes them so good at consulting. I mean, that's what I know is consulting and technology transformation, all the stuff we talk about on the show. I think women are particularly good at it because they can, especially if they can walk, kind of straddle both sides of that. and it's hard to do. I know a lot of women that struggle with that. But if you can be strong and have that, not be afraid to be as tough as a man, or I'm not talking physically, obviously, but just mentally and the drive and all that stuff. But then you also have that softer side and the empathy and the just the more relatable personality traits. I think that can be very powerful. So I think just finding that right balance and knowing when to to dial up either side of that in different situations, I think that's a pretty powerful tool that most, or not tool, but trait that most men don't have.
I think that's big. I think it's, hearing you say that, and hopefully that falls on ears that needed to hear it, is, if you know your business and you know what you're talking about, you have the right intentions, etc. Being confident in those ideas and bringing them forward is what's going to set you apart, and not swaying because of fear of what it might look like externally. So I think you mentioning that, I imagine there are a lot of men that feel the same way, that they aren't even thinking about that. And it's more so sometimes in a woman's own thoughts that she's thinking about it and limiting herself in a sense. But, a lot of it, I think, plays into how is it received as well. So, I appreciate you, calling that out and recognizing that.
Yeah, yeah, and I think if anyone that has worked with people like Daryl, I think you'd see that she's good at walking that balance. She knows, she's very good at, and this, I'm coming back to your question, even though I'm using Daryl as an example. I think her and other effective female leaders, and I think this could apply to men too, if men would take the time to think about this, is if you kind of act like a chameleon in some ways and really read your audience and understand when you're maybe pushing too hard, or if you're coming across as too abrasive, not that you just want to roll over and be spineless or whatever, but you can kind of throttle that back and maybe add a softer touch based on that. So I think a big part of what women are, and this is a broad generalization, so I apologize if it comes across as a stereotype, but women are generally better at reading people, I think, than men are. So if you can use that strength and say, okay, I'm a strong person, I'm trying to be strong, for whatever reason, this person is totally turned off by it or put off by it, and it's not working. You don't want to change who you are, but you can add more of the empathy and more of the softer touch to it. I think it's just a matter of navigating that. And if anyone's equipped to do that, I would think that women, are even more equipped than men to do that.
Yeah. I mean, it applies across the board. I think it all comes back to the concept of emotional intelligence. And, I think there's 5 pillars to emotional intelligence. Let me think back to my days in college in business management. I think it was empathy is one, self-awareness, self-management, and 2 others. But what you just said is spot on. I mean, self-awareness and empathy. And if you can read the room, it's going to improve the situation for everybody in the room. So definitely something to keep in mind as a leader, whether you're in the consulting world, IT world, finance, etc. It applies.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting too, and I know you had observations about this, is how she's not only is she is Daryl in an industry that is male dominated, but even within our industry, she's in a part of the industry that's super male dominated. When you talk about data and security, that's about as male dominated as you can get in our space. So it's interesting to hear her journey of how she started off more on the CFO side. So she kind of proved herself in the corporate America, typical corporate ladder type of advancement. She did very well there, and then she sort of jumped over into this side of the world that we're on, and was able to navigate that really well.
Right, I agree, and I think, it shows in what she's talking about. She obviously knows her business, she knows what she's doing. Just in my questions to her about cybersecurity, what can people on a personal level do these days? Because it all trickles into, if you're taking care of um, your digital space personally these days, then you're also taking care of the company you work for. So I'm curious, that kind of sparked a question in my mind. Obviously, it was way accelerated in 2020, kind of this threat of cyber security. But how has it evolved throughout your career, Eric? I mean, you've been in this industry for 20 years. The past 20 years, technology has just skyrocketed. So, how have you seen cybersecurity transition and evolve since you started in this industry?
Well, the frequency of outside hacks and attacks seems to have increased. I don't know if there's data out there that supports that or backs that, but I would suspect there probably is. It just seems like there's just a lot more to worry about now, partly because you have so much happening in the cloud to where it's a little bit more publicly accessible or you know, easier to get to. But then the common thread, I'd say the thing that hasn't really changed, but is still a significant risk or concern, is the whole concept of internal security. You know, a lot of times people are more worried about closing off their systems to outside hacks, but you also have to worry about the security you do or don't set up internally with your systems to ensure that, you know, if you've got a larger organization with tens of thousands of employees, there's a high likelihood that you have a couple bad apples somewhere in there, no matter how good your hiring processes are, your background checks, and all that stuff. So you do have to worry about, you know, the people that might have access to create vendors and create payments and start, you know, setting up fake invoices to pay themselves money or to buy themselves stuff. And you know, so you have to think about that internal those internal exceptions that don't happen often, but when they do, they can be pretty damaging. We actually had an interview on here a few weeks ago talking about the ERP failure at Queensland Health. And I don't know if you recall this, but when during that interview we were talking about how someone had spent about, I think it was $17 million on Gucci handbags and luxury goods for themselves, somehow with a flaw or a loophole in the system and the security, the way it was set up. They were able to buy all this stuff for themselves, and there was no control in place. And so it's stuff like that you've got to worry about, in addition to getting hacked by the outside groups.
Yeah, I mean, it's just everywhere these days for sure. So I think Daryl said, yeah, I mean, she's been on our show before and she's shared so much, so many little things that we could each be doing, from changing our passwords to watching what websites we go on to, you know, all the other things as well. So definitely something to take seriously, especially today.
Yeah, and if that's a topic of interest to you and you're listening, if you want to learn more about cybersecurity and that whole thread, Daryl was actually on our very first episode, so episode 1 of Transformation Ground Control, and we had an interview with her just talking about cybersecurity. So go back and listen to that interview. It's a good one if you want to hear more from Daryl and or more about cybersecurity.
She's a wealth of knowledge, that lady.
She is. Yep, she's very, very smart.